Okay, so warmly welcome to this midday lunch seminar, and this will be held in English, so everyone is aware about that. We are going to talk about climate change in the Middle East. So warmly welcome. This panel addresses an extremely complex and dense and urgent problem of climate change. And we often hear alarm calls in regards to extreme heat, not least in the Middle East. We hear about other alarm reports that the climate change caused the Syrian war and that water is about to run out in the Middle East. But we also know, and which has also been highlighted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, that predicts actually that the Middle East will face extreme weather, more dry spells, and extreme rainfall that will cause severe flooding and will, of course, obviously affect agriculture production. So key factors here are rising temperatures, water scarcity, desertification, sea level rise, and the only way actually to change this trend and this severity that we see in the Middle East is actually by finding new ways to live, use the land, prevent and rebuild and actually restructure even societies that, for instance, live very close to the sea. For instance, with the sea level rise we have in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, for instance, communities very nearby, they will all be flooded. So this needs to be tackled, this needs to be problematized. And we have here the super expert panel who all engage on this very urgent problem, and in various interdisciplinary projects at Lund University, and also Stefan, who's from Uppsala University, collaborate with different disciplines to resolve and to find new pathways of how we can understand this. So we have first Linda Eklund, who's a researcher at the Center for Advanced Middle Eastern Studies, but also a lecturer in physical geography and ecosystem science at Lund University, have done extensive research on the links between drought, the land use change, migration, conflict, particularly related to Syria and Iraq. And you are also doing collaborative work together with Pinar on wildfires. And wildfires is something that we also can relate to in Sweden, not least actually during this summer, also in 2018. We saw what happened when we have very dry summers. Suddenly, very quickly, we actually experienced something similar. Saura Brogard, who has a different background, is also a researcher at the center, but also at the Center for Sustainability Studies at Lund University, specialized on livelihoods in relations to land changes, processes, and climate variabilities. But you also participate in one of our big projects at the center on artificial intelligence and dust storms control in the Middle East, which is, again, of utmost important. We know that this kind of dust storm has all different and serious repercussions. Pinar Dink, also a CMS researcher, a lecturer in political science, have done extensive work on Turkey, the Kurds, nationalism, ethnicity, conflict, and also recently now also exploring the nexus between environmental challenges and, as I said, on wildfires together with Lena. And then Stefan, the last but not least, Stefan Döring, researcher at Uppsala University in the interdisciplinary peace and conflict research. So your take is like focusing on cooperation, conflict, and the possibilities of peace by looking also on non-state actors, but also how droughts affect the region and the access of water during armed conflicts. This is crucial, actually. We all need water, and this is always, the flow of water is always being affected by conflict, and it has very strong repercussions. And you have looked particularly on Syrian and Iraqi refugees also and done extensive surveys on that, so we look forward to hearing that. And for the ones who didn't attend our panel before, I'm Karen Agerstam, Professor in Political Science, and I'm also the Director for the Center for Advanced Middle Eastern Studies at Lund University. So we will talk about these challenges and focusing and trying to understand and unpack that. So Lena, you have actually made and contributed with expertise to the IPCC's panel and provided insights and recommendations. What do you perceive as the main challenges in the Middle East in regards to climate change?
Well, I mean, if you look at the IPCC, you read about what you mentioned here, like with more extreme temperatures, more extreme weather, more droughts, more dryness. But if you look more into detail in the IPCC report, you actually find that there is not so much information about the Middle East specifically. So that's a challenge in itself, that the research on the Middle East in terms of climate is a bit limited if you compare with other areas of the world. But when it comes to the climate challenges that I'm looking into, I'm focusing on drought and how that impacts agriculture and livelihoods in the region. I've also looked a little bit at the extreme temperature and how they affect health. What happens when areas become inhabitable? It becomes too warm to actually live there. And then also, like you mentioned, the wildfires, that we actually see more fires in certain regions of the Middle East.
Yes, yeah. So thank you. Sara, you have done a lot of work on the oftentimes interrelated impacts and challenges, how they intersect. So it's not just one or two, but they interact, and that makes the severity. So what do you perceive as being the main links here, factors interacting that has quite dramatic effects on climate change?
Yeah, I would like to sort of bring back to this topic that many of our sustainability challenges, they have a climate component, but they also have a clear land use component or other sort of challenges that come together. And this is something we recognize from earlier debates about desertification, land degradation, and this is something I think in particularly comes together when we are looking at the Middle East and the sandstorms that we are now in a project studying, so that we are seeing sort of earlier sandstorms. We're seeing an extension of sandstorms in time, particularly last year in the spring. We're also seeing higher frequency, and that sort of is most likely related to climate change, but also to, for example, land use factors. You, in some areas, are abandoned land because of conflicts, but you also have water management. Upstream water use reduces the water that comes in this context in Iraq, and makes more areas available as sources for dust storms. So, for example, if you reduce water area, they can become dust storms. So it's a combination of factors, mismanagement and climate.
And thinking about the Middle East is such a vast and actually varied different areas. And I think, Pinar, how do you see, for instance, when it comes to Turkey, you have focused a lot. I mean, Turkey has, as we all know, actually a regional power position, also in regards to water, for instance, with the Euphrates Basin.
Yeah.
So how does it look from that horizon?
Yeah, it was actually, it complements with what Sarah just said, because Turkey is in the Middle East, and Middle East is home to 12 out of 17 water-stressed countries in the world. So it is really an area with an immediate and urgent problem. And like Sarah mentioned, there are countries with the upstream and downstream, and this actually becomes an issue in politics as well, because how you control the water, it's pretty much political. Turkey is known to be the hydro-hegemonic power in the region, but you can also reframe it and say that Turkey is weaponizing water in its conflict relations with conflict when it comes to Syria and Iraq, actually impacting a lot. Not sending water there has agricultural consequences, livelihood consequences, and also actually, if you think about it, it's not only about agriculture as well. It's about drinking water problems and a lot of health issues related to that. So it's very political as well.
Yeah, exactly. So you need to bring in the politics as well. Stefan, you have done so much work on, particularly, as I said, on Syria and Iraq. So if we want to contextualize within these sort of communities and settings, because it's oftentimes difficult to generalize also, we need to also look on the communities and the local level. So what do you perceive as the key challenges?
I mean, I agree with lots of the things that have already been talked about. I mean, in one way, we have quite high certainty that things like heat waves, water scarcity will increase. And we already are talking about a very scarce region to begin with. And at the same time, we have projected population increase. I think the Middle East is projected to grow by 200 million people in the next 30 years. So we have to keep very limited resources to an ever-growing population. So, and I also totally agree with, like, a lot of these challenges are intersecting. Like, they're never. If you look at water scarcity, you also look at food security, energy production, and health issues. So the challenges are definitely multifaceted. Just to give you like one example, I mean, Middle East, for example, uses a lot of groundwater. Groundwater extraction is in many places has been over extracted, and that leads to salinated water and like not safe water to consume. But at the same time, it also deeper groundwater abstraction requires energy, but we need energy also for other things. So like dams, for example, are often a cooling system for nuclear power plants. So there's do we use the water for this, or do we use it for irrigation? So these are all like challenges that I think in one way these countries all face together also, and that require further cooperation.
Interesting. So moving on to actually when you mention health issues, this is what, I mean, again, the multiplicity of effects and impacts. So if we look more precisely on the societal impacts of climate change in the Middle East, so Pinar, as a political scientist, what socio-political effects would you see and perceive
Well, I think
in the region?
Yeah, I think maybe one of the most recent and well-known debates was about the water scarcity in Syria and if it had led to conflict and uprising in the area. And we actually have done some research about that. I was in Turkey last summer speaking to former Syrian farmers. And there you actually then realize that once again, that climate change is actually among the many factors that have societal consequences. We should talk about corruption in the region, economic inequalities, social inequalities, authoritarianism, and so on. Which and of course, related to that, there is bad governance or lack of governance in the region, which is leading to such harsh and complicated societal consequences. I mean, one example, adding to what you said, is, for instance, when I was talking to them, they were saying that, we used to use wells and we would go down as like a few meters and it became a few hundred meters, and no matter what we did, it wasn't enough. And then they would also talk about oil that they had to use for that, or electricity, and then they didn't have enough oil or electricity to dig the wells, and then it becomes an issue about how do they deal with this? Then it becomes a migration issue, and it doesn't have to start with external migration. It starts with temporary, short distance migration, where you go and come back, and then as things escalate and as it becomes almost impossible for these people to continue living there, that is usually the triggering thing. What I have heard from my respondents was that it was the conflict. When the war came to their villages, then it was required that they had to leave immediately. So I can say that climate impacts are there, they are real, they are really dealing with a lot of water scarcity issues, but they're resilient as well, and they're trying to mitigate these things. But when things combine with different elements, then it becomes much more difficult.
Yes, during the 1990s, there was all these talks about the opportunities that actually water scarcity does not necessarily trigger war, as was presumed before, but actually could be sort of fostering the spirit of peace and water cooperation. So there was a lot of programs launched in many different parts, actually, in the region, projects. So, Stefan, you have done work on water cooperation, and we know that it's super central, because if it's something that we do need to cooperate over, and it's transgress borders. And actually, I have to mention actually a very interesting project going on between Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians, despite the fact that all the diplomatic efforts on the high political level is all blocked, it's all frozen, it's dead more or less, the Middle East peace process. But interestingly enough, there are 11 communities that have cross-border collaboration in regards to water, because they know, the small communities in the villages, that they have to collaborate, because if you are not dealing with your whatever water source you have in a proper way, it will affect me, and I need to collaborate with you no matter what the politicians or the diplomats are saying. So I'm thinking, Stefan, what do you see the opportunities and limitations of water cooperation? Are there some preconditions that have to be in place before, or do you see it's taking place on some levels, not others? Because we know that states like big projects, dams, prestige, it's part of the nation building, but often have counterproductive effects on the local communities. So what's your take?
I think you're already sort of providing some of the answers. I think it's very crucial to look at the level, like where we look at state levels, interstate, or sort of cross-communal, and I think a lot of research has shown that on the interstate level there's more cooperation. Now Israel's certainly a special case given its relations in the region, but overall we see more. But then also things like you mentioned, dams are usually triggers of some sort of conflict or disputes. I wouldn't say armed conflict, but some sort of conflict. And then, of course, at the lower level, where some of my research shows, for example, that we see sort of that without non-state, I call it non-state cooperation, so not involving the state directly, at least. We see often in less democratic countries, for example, because people take sort of things into their own hands. But then at the same time, we know also from other research that we need good governance, we need institutions, and also taking communities within their decision-making processes. So I think definitely we need governance and institutions, and that could also be fostered by international actors, but together with local partners.
Great. And Sarah, I think you have sort of a different take here. I mean, you have focused a lot on societal impacts also in other areas like Africa and other regions. But you also have this ongoing project on dust storms, which we hear maybe less of, more maybe only when they are actually taking place. But what is the societal impact there? And what have you, for now, I know that you're sort of in the midst of your project, but what have you seen of interest there?
Yeah, we are definitely seeing major impacts in relation to those dust storms event. And I am also seeing, like Jun mentioned, Pinar, about inequality in society, that we have vulnerable groups that are more prone to get impacted by these dust storm. And for example, we have certain parts of society, we have maybe children, elderly people. If you already have a precondition of asthma or allergies or so on, you're much easily impacted by these issues. And then, of course, it's sort of on a societal level that you have GDP losses that are estimated in sort of billions, because you interrupt infrastructure. Maybe oil tankers are not being filled and cannot dock, and you have GDP losses, airport implications, and so on. And it's often interesting to see when it downstreams, you have sort of economic centers. Then you see the major action and acknowledge the problem sort of in a more freeway.
It's also interesting the different approaches that you have to study climate change in the Middle East. I mean, ranging from actually field work to artificial intelligence. And Lina, you are doing work on GIS. And so that is a way of actually studying these phenomenons remotely, you could say. So what is the take from that view, sort of?
Yeah, so I have, I use GIS and remote sensing, which is Earth observation using mostly satellite images. So I view the Middle East from space, which is, it's a different perspective than the ground perspective. And it's a very useful way of working in especially in countries that are affected by conflict, where you cannot always go there and see what's going on, but you can take images going back to the 70s actually and see what happened with agriculture, what happened with water, sizes of dams, sizes of lakes, and so on. So, and I've used those methods to study Syria together with Pinar and study this narrative about how climate change and specifically a severe drought affected or increased the risk of conflict before 2011. And the claim has then been that the drought led to agricultural failures, even an agricultural collapse, some would say, and then that in turn led to increased migration, like a really massive migration from agricultural areas to cities, which then put pressure on cities and created this really like strong tension in the cities that led to protests in 2011. So we look into what actually happened. Was there an agricultural collapse, or like what happened with agriculture just before 2011? And can we see signs of migration? So we both talk to people about migration, but we also look at land abandonment. So we can see if a field was harvested or not in a certain year. And what's interesting here is that we find that during the worst drought year, which was 2008, we had a really strong reduction in actively cultivated land. So many fields were left fallow, maybe some were sown but not harvested because the crops failed. But then we see in 2009 and 2010, we see a recovery. So again, in 2010, nearly all of the croplands in northeastern Syria, which is the part that we're looking at mostly and that was most affected by drought, were actually cultivated that year, which indicates that either people left for the city for 1 or 2 years and then they came back and cultivated their lands, or maybe they sold their lands to someone else, but someone was there to work on the lands. And that's a really interesting finding in this whole debate about the role of drought. And it shows that it's more complex than just saying that just because the drought happened before the uprising means they are connected.
Can I add something
Super
to that?
interesting. Yes, sure.
I mean, I think one of the benefits of being able to use satellite images is that when we're talking about such conflict-ridden places, everything becomes political. The narratives there are political. Everyone has a political stance. They speak from a certain perspective, and it's not united. There are various opinions. So using them to do research is often not enough, because it then becomes criticized for following one of the dominant lines of arguments. But when you check the same region from satellite images and then combine that sort of information with ground-based information, then it becomes something else. So I really think that it's there's so much value to using these methods.
Very true. And we actually related to, in the beginning, to this with wildfires and how it actually may take place also in Sweden. And we saw how we did not cope with the wildfires up north in 2018. And I would say, interesting parallel now, if something would happen this year, because it's very dry, if the capacity is there actually now, because it was for sure not in 2018. So that triggers actually the question of what can we here in Sweden and in Europe actually learn from the region. It's not only exporting ideas from here, but actually drawing insights. And I know, for instance, with Syria, The old kanat systems, and there are different traditional practices that are at times actually revived. So I'm just thinking, what can we learn from the region? And this is a tricky question. I think about you, Stefan, as a peace and conflict scholar. We often try to come up with some suggestions or some recommendations. That's sort of the tradition within the field. So what would you say? What can we learn from the Middle East of relevance to Sweden and Europe in regards to your research?
Oh, that I wasn't prepared for the last part, but in general, I would say that there's a lot we can learn, because I don't know if anybody's seen the Swedish meteorological organization SMHI. They have made very good projections for Sweden, and it's gonna get warmer here, and it's gonna be less precipitation or less snowfall in certain areas, and it's gonna have an impact on our groundwater and our surface water, and they also, something we have to be honest with in Sweden, we're really bad at using water. Like, we have a water abundance, and that leads us to probably use water in wrong ways, and we can probably learn a lot about targeted irrigation for farming, about how to deal with water leakages, or how to use water more sustainably. I think that's something we can already learn now and try to implement, because we have maybe a little bit more time than other places. And also about urban planning, and our houses aren't made for. Our house isn't made for 30 degrees or something. Our houses are made for keeping warm. So we need to rethink a little bit about very practical things. And yes, in my research, so we need to strengthen the ways how people can share water within certain areas, because it will probably be that we need to transfer water to the south of Sweden, for example, because there is not so much natural water there. So there needs to be both governance initiatives, but also on different levels, both at the national scale, but down to the commune.
Thanks, Stefan. Lena, you put a lot of emphasis, which I really like, on science communication, also beyond academia. So this is one audience here, for instance. But I really appreciate that. So what is your key message to local stakeholders outside of academia? What can we learn of relevance for Sweden here or Europe? And again, you have participated in the IPCC, so I know that you've been thinking about that. So what are the key messages if you want to have an impact, societal impact, with your research?
Yeah, I think it's really important to keep an open mind and understand that the Middle East is a region that has had dry weather, dry conditions for a long time. It's not something new. Drought is not something new in Syria or Iraq or Turkey or anywhere. And it shows that even though there are narratives about drought impacting conflict risk, the way we look at it is that it's all about adaptation. How do you handle a drought? And I think there are a lot of knowledge in the Middle East about how to handle dry situation. This is the area where agriculture is said to be invented. You mentioned some of these traditional systems for water harvesting. You have kanats, which are underground tunnels that lead the water to agricultural fields using gravity and not pumping out the water. So when the water runs out, you have to wait for a bit and then it replenishes again. There are also floodwater spreading systems that our colleague Hussein at the center has been working on, where you have you can actually reduce the risk of floods by spreading the water and then letting it inundate areas that then can be used for agriculture. So there are lots of smart ideas that are not these big-scale dam projects that are actually costly, problematic, and also leaks a lot of water through evaporation. But the main problem I see is that government stakeholders, they like these big projects that sound good, when it's actually the more old technologies and easier solutions that could make a difference. So that's what I want to convey.
And that's very interesting. I was thinking, Sarah, you on sustainability, and sustainability is related to resilience. And sometimes, as you say, Lena, it's not the big project, but actually it's just changing everyday practices that is maybe necessary. So what do you think? What lessons are learned here?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to again emphasize that climate change is a sort of global environmental problem and an existential problem, and that we need sort of collaboration. So in these days, I think it's important that we underscore that we need to continue research collaboration and different projects where we have mutual learning opportunities, because we cannot take for granted that we will all the time be the ones who are sort of seeing, can draw some more advantages than disadvantages. And something when it comes to sort of learning experience, I would also like to bring in that we need, I think, further research on sort of contextual vulnerability. So not only looking at a specific impact, a modeling study, and what does it say about water and how can we potentially adapt, but sort of if we take a contextual vulnerability approach, we want to see like when, who, and how are people sort of actually impacted, and why are they impacted? Are there certain parts of society that feel particularly vulnerable in certain context and at certain times, and where we can also go in and make sort of specific intervention. And I think that's particularly the case when we're talking about these droughts that we've had, and farmers who are actually becoming very sort of struck by this and have to handle the situation. And then also relating to your research, that maybe also even sort of further dimensions of mental and physical health impact on a range of groups in society, that we look into that and carefully take that into account, and maybe move some of the research that you've done in Syria to the Swedish context and explore those sort of further. We saw in the 2018 drought in interviews that we did with farmers here that almost close to 70-80% felt clearly mental sort of impact of this drought that we had. So yeah, maybe that's more sort of the problems that we have, but also how we need to work and study them.
Yeah.
So
Very interesting. And then by the end of the day, we know that we do need the politics there. It's not only about finding technical solutions or recognize the societal impact, but it needs some forward-looking politics here. So Pinar, as the political scientist here, on an end note, we often look on limitations, but what political pathways can there be, and what can be learned? And
yeah, I would say, I mean, simply not turning a blind eye to what's happening in the Middle East, not only from a climate perspective, but also from a political perspective, is really important, because going back to what I said in the beginning, it's not only about the climate change, it's also about the leadership in these countries, in the region. It's about the economic structures, social inequalities, discrimination, and so on. So if we don't turn a blind eye to what's happening there, and just not think about water scarcity as this isolated event, but this thing that has a lot of societal, political, economic consequences, would change a lot of things, I would say. And I think, again, the Syrian issue is a good example, because we have seen that environment has no boundaries. When there is a problem in that region, it immediately affects the other parts of the world. And migration is an example of that. What I have heard from one of the interviewees was that he was saying that as a former farmer from Syria, he came to Turkey and he started doing agriculture in Turkey. And then he was saying, well, now there's also water scarcity here. It's not like before. So now I'm thinking, like, I can't do it here either. I want to go to Europe, right? And then another example I can say, well, we did surveys in January, and 6 months later, when I was doing the interviews, I interviewed some of the persons that have responded to the survey questions, and I asked the same question again. We asked, like, what are your projections about your future? And for some people who previously said, well, I'm happy here, I'm planning to stay in Turkey, we're saying, well, now the economy in Turkey is so bad, and that it has become really expensive to live here, to stay here. So I also, I want to either go back to Syria, or I want to find ways to Europe, and so on. So these climate-related issues are never isolated. So it's really important that from the Swedish perspective or the European perspective, It's important to continue funding projects, continue helping people, and doing that by knowing that you have to deal with climate as well as the political structures you're dealing with in that region.
Super interesting. We are now actually opening up for some questions from the audience to provide the opportunity to get some feedback from the panel here. If you have some questions to be raised, they can be done in Swedish as well, so you don't have to be reluctant. We can do a quick translation, and I think most of us actually understand also Swedish, so no problem with that. Any question out here? Climate change is a big thing also here, so it's like... Welcome.
I was wondering, why do you think that you couldn't find so much data from the IPCC about the Middle East? What was lacking? Why was it lacking?
Why it's not, there's no data. Okay, I think it's, I mean, the IPCC reports are big assessment reports of the existing research on climate change. They cover the physical science, like what changes are we seeing, what projections do we have, but also about vulnerability, adaptation, what's happening more on the local levels. And I think the reason is just that there is a limited focus on climate change in the Middle East. And that's something I'm seeing too in my research. When I want to do a literature review for a topic, I need to really look for, and there are limited amounts of studies. So I think the focus is elsewhere.
Okay, Stefan.
Yeah, I just wanted to add also, so for example, I contributed to a report on climate and conflict in the Arab region, and that was also something we noticed, that there's not very much research. And now lately I'm also working more with health issues and, for example, mental health. On mental health and drought, there's not a single study on Africa or the Middle East. They're all on with farmers in Australia or other places. So there's clearly like a large gap, and if we want to contextualize this better, we need to study these issues globally and not just in a few other countries.
We had a question down there, Anders.
Thank you. Thank you for a great panel. Somebody in the beginning, I can't remember who, said that 12 out of the 17, I think, most water-stressed countries were
I
in the
read
Middle
that.
East. Yeah.
I mean,
Do you know which are sort of the most water-stressed countries, or sort of which are the top three? Or
I think Turkey, I mean, you can help me there. Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria, I think they include Yemen, Jordan.
I'm
I'd
going to
say.
count to 12 now.
Like, yeah, but like,
Yeah.
What else? I mean, I don't know. I would check.
And maybe only to add there, actually, this will change also, because, I mean, Israel was also part of the conundrum, but then they just took off with desalination. So that was sort of the reasoning behind in the peace process, that they had all these water projects because they thought that would get the Palestinians and the Israelis together. And now Israel found a way of unilaterally improve its situation by desalinating salt water, and suddenly have no problem any longer. So this change also, I think, with the ranking, it's the same thing in the Gulf, for instance, with the Gulf states there doing a lot of desal, and that relates then to energy, of course. So that triggers the question. We had another question there, yes?
Thanks for a really important and good panel. I have a question about fossil groundwater, because obviously a lot of countries in the region have been very reliant and over-reliant on that, and I wonder both kind of what initiatives are taken to reduce that, because I know some of the states have been extremely happy to just use whatever is there, and also what push is there from the outside to kind of minimize usage of fossil groundwater.
Thank you. Who would like to pick up on that one?
I can. Do you mean by fossil groundwater like very old? Yeah, that's very deep. Well, the way that I understand it, most of that is actually not so useful because it's often very salinated, and or sometimes has other like it might be phosphorus or things like that. It's actually easier than to use salt water from the sea and desalinate that instead of using that water. That's the way that I understand it from some of the experts I've talked to. I don't know if somebody else wants to.
Well, I mean, I can't really answer your question, but it makes me think about if you look at Google Earth, where you can see satellite images, you can go to Saudi Arabia, and I think you can change the years, and you can see that in the desert there, at some point, they have like these really big irrigated round fields in the desert. It makes no sense, and I'm pretty sure that's from like pretty deep wells. But I don't think they are doing that anymore because it wasn't feasible.
Okay, any other question here? If not, please join me to thank the panel for a fantastic analysis of a great question from the audience. So thanks very much for attending this panel. Thank you.